Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010 for the summer session 2019. And here's our book, Introduction to World Philosophy. And in this video, we'll be going over the questions about David Hume, the British empiricist. So we talked about John Locke, the British empiricist, in the previous video. He was followed by David Hume, who took the empiricist perspective to the next level. Empiricism means knowledge comes from sense perceptions, either through sight or sound or smells or tastes or touching or hearing. So the five senses, that if knowledge is not rooted in some one of your five sense perceptions, it's just a figment of your imagination. So, for example, a self. Do I see a self? Do I see a soul? I can't see souls. I can't taste them or smell them or touch them or hear them. So, therefore, that's a figment of my imagination. It's a fiction, so says David Hume. And the exam questions for exam 1 that we'll be addressing in this video are for Part B, questions 7, 8, and 9. So this is going to be concluding the Part B questions, and then the next video I'll be going over the rest of Part A questions. So question 7 in Part B, according to Hume's empiricist philosophy, what conditions would be required for the existence of a self? In other words, what conditions would have to be met in order for him to accept the idea of a self? So what is a self? That's the fundamental question that we're going over here. And René Descartes, in line with Plato and the Hindus, say a self is a soul, unextended in space, yet is capable of thinking. And according to the Hindus and Plato, the self, the soul, is eternal. It's filled with absolute knowledge. And when the body dies, the self continues, the soul continues from one body to the next, until you escape the cycle of reincarnation. For René Descartes, he did not accept the theory of reincarnation, and he didn't accept that any other animals except the human animal had souls in them. But he also agreed there's a soul, and the quality of the soul is thinking. It's a thinking substance that's not extended in space. So Hume, an empiricist, he's saying, I'm going to reject that because I can't perceive what you're talking about. So let's just get into Hume on page 284. David Hume from A Treatise of Human Nature. So he starts out by saying, there are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call our self, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence and are certain beyond the evidence of a demonstration both of its perfect identity and simplicity. So those two words are important for philosophy and for this video. Identity and simplicity. Identity means it's the same thing now as it was in the past, and it will be identical to itself in the future. If that can be the case, then you have something that is identical to itself from moment to moment. And simple means not made of parts, not compounded of parts. It is one uncompounded thing. So it would have to have no extension in space, because if it did have extension in space, then you could imagine it being composed of parts. You could imagine dividing it. So indivisible and simple mean the same thing. And as long as we're on it, and so this was the very first sentence, and it's an important one, discussion, or the potential exam question number 9 from Part B for exam 1. In what ways are Hume's theory about the self different than Plato's? So Plato said the self is one simple, indivisible, unchanging entity. And we'll get to that as we go through that, but that is what Hume is addressing, that definition of the self. And then René Descartes, he kept at least the idea of a simple, unextended thinking substance. This is also what Hume is addressing. So, but continuing with David Hume on page 284, he says, the strongest sensation, the most violent passion, say they, like people like Plato and Descartes, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it the more intensely, and make us consider their influence on self either by their pain or pleasure. We must have a self because we experience pain and pleasure. It's obvious. It's self-evident. To attempt a farther proof of this were to weaken its evidence, since no proof can be derived from any fact of which we are so intimately conscious, nor is there anything of which we can be certain if we doubt of this. That is what Hume's opponents will say. He goes on to say, unluckily, all these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them, nor have we any idea of a self after the manner it is here explained. So then here's his question. As an empiricist, knowledge comes from a sense organ, one of the 5 sense organs. Well then, from what impression could this idea be derived? From what sense impression could the idea of a self be derived? Can you see it, smell it, touch it, hear it, taste it? If the answer is no, then it's a figment of your imagination. So he goes on to say, this question, 'tis impossible to answer without a manifest contradiction and absurdity, and yet 'tis a question which must necessarily be answered if we would have the idea of self pass for clear and intelligible. It must be some one impression that gives rise to every real idea. But self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference.' So he's saying there is no single uninterrupted sense impression that correlates to the idea of a self. You have sights, different sounds, different tastes, different thoughts, different emotions. None of them are connected. They're all discrete, unconnected, and yet they're occurring so rapidly they give the illusion of one continuous flow, that he'll go on to say. But if you were going to have a self, all of those impressions would have to be simultaneously in front of your eyes, as he'll go on to say. So he says, it must be some one impression that gives rise to every real idea, but self or person is not any one impression, but that to which are several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. It cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. That's his argument in a nutshell. He's an empiricist. He doesn't believe in absolute ideas or absolute forms of knowledge imprinted on a soul because he can't perceive them with his sense impressions. This is exactly the opposite of Plato, as we will see. But I want to continue going over Hume's argument here. He says, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long as I am insensible of myself and may truly be said not to exist. Okay, so if he has no sense impressions, he doesn't exist. And he goes on to say that, and were all my perceptions removed by death, and could I neither think nor feel nor see nor love nor hate after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated. Nor do I conceive what is farther required to make me a perfect non-entity. When the body dies, you're gone, because knowledge comes from sense perceptions. Our consciousness is what we more or less identify with. It is rooted to sense perceptions, rooted in sense perceptions, so no body, no sense perceptions, no illusion of a continuous self. Thus you're utterly annihilated. We saw the Indian materialist philosopher Charvaka say the same thing on page 231. He doesn't believe in an afterlife. He is similarly an empiricist. Show me the self. It isn't there. So if you refer back to page 231, you can read that again. I am going to read now. So I've gone over question B7. I mean, I've mentioned it. I'm still going to go over it, which is, what would you have to have, according to Hume, for there to be a self? And question 9, how is Hume's theory different than Plato's? Question 8 is, in what way is Hume's argument similar to Nagasena's Buddhist argument in Questions to King Malinda? So like the Buddhists, Hume is saying there is no self. Anatman, say the Buddhists, no Atman, no little individual atomic self that transmigrates. Yes, they believe in reincarnation, but what's reincarnating is this vicious cycle of illusion, of karma, of karmic reaction, identifying itself falsely with a self. So it's a difficult philosophical point for Buddhists to explain. How can there be a reincarnation without a soul? But they do explain that, and their goal ultimately is to realize you don't exist, and then you won't have any more desires, and if you don't have any more desires, you won't accrue any more karma, and you can merge back into nirvana, the impersonal, blissful ground of being that cannot be described with words adequately. So David Hume is not like the Buddhists in that respect. He doesn't believe in some transcendental spiritual energy, but he is like the Buddhists in the respect that he says there's no individual self. Nothing stays the same from moment to moment. It's just fleeting sense impressions and ever-changing body parts, that it's just a name. That's what a self is. It is merely a denomination. As long as we're on it, I might as well go to near the end of Hume's article on page 289. On the right-hand column, the bottom paragraph, he says, the whole of this doctrine leads us to a conclusion, which is of great importance to the present affair, that all the nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided and are to be regarded rather as grammatical than as philosophical difficulties. Identity depends on the relations of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of that easy transition they occasion. So you have this memory of all these sense impressions, and you imagine ideas that connect them, like cause and effect. And this smooth and easy transition of your ideas from your whole past life gives the illusion of one continuous thing. But really, the idea of a self is just a word. It doesn't apply to any empirically real thing. So continuing here, he says, all right, so identity depends on the relation of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of that easy transition they occasion. But as the relations and the easiness of the transition may diminish by insensible degrees, we have no just standard by which we can decide any dispute concerning the time when they acquire or lose a title to the name of identity. So memories. Are you the same person you were when you were 5 years old? Well, you can remember when you were 5 a little bit, but then that memory fades. So there's no just standard by which we can determine when did that memory of my 5-year-old self become me and then stop being me. If it gets interrupted, is it the same me when I remember it again? It seems like my self gets interrupted every time I forget something. If you look up at the top of page 289 on the right-hand column, he says, as a memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions, all of your sense perceptions and emotions, that's what you are. And it's memory alone that acquaints you with them. 'Tis to be considered upon that account chiefly as the source of personal identity. That's why memory is the source of who you are. We saw John Locke say the same thing. If you look back on page 277, knowing who you are right now, self-reflection plus memories equals the self. But the problem is, he says, we forget what we've done occasionally. So that has to be dealt with. Well, Hume's dealing with it, and he's saying, yep, that's a fatal problem with the theory of identifying the self with memory, and what it really means is there is no self. So continuing here at the top of 289, had we no memory, we never should have any notion of causation, nor consequently of that chain of causes and effects which constitute our self or person. So, okay, he'll say, granted, he says over on the left-hand column, what I did in the past isn't happening right now, and my memory might come and go. But what doesn't change is the fact that historically each event in my life is connected to the event that followed by a chain of causes and effects. So this chain of cause and effects, which is continuous, constitutes myself. So he responds to that by saying, okay, show me this chain of cause and effect. Where is the actual link? I experience emotions, I experience different sights, sounds, smells, touches, and tastes, but none of them are connected in any tangible way, in any way that makes an impression on my sense organs. So what you're saying is cause and effect. It's really just you're accustomed to seeing that sequence of events. And then because things always happen, I eat food, then I feel full. So therefore eating food must cause me to feel full. He'll say, well, yes, that is the way it has always been in the past, but you can't be sure that that will always be the way in the future. There's no invariably unchanging universal law that's connecting this eating and feeling full. That's just you're accustomed to seeing that, and so you assume there's some actual connection, but really that's just a relationship that you've discerned in your mind. It's not empirically observable. So if cause and effect is just an idea of relationships between empirically observable things, eating food, feeling full, and if it's therefore just an idea, it's not real. And if the idea of a self is the causal link between all of your memories, well, then there's no self, because the causal link is imaginary. So if we look, I'm going to go back here to page 285, and he says, on the left-hand column, he's speaking to the people who believe in a self. He says, he may perhaps perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself, though I am certain there is no such principle in me. But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux of movement. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is still more variable than our sight, and all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change, nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment. Then he says the mind is a kind of a theater, thoughts come and go. There's an infinite variety of postures. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity in different, whatever natural propension we have to imagine that simplicity and identity. Again, this is relating to Plato's Phaedo, and since one of the potential exam questions is comparing Hume to Plato, part B, number 9 for exam 1, let us look to page 254 in Plato's Phaedo. So Plato is depicting now his teacher Socrates in jail, having been arrested for corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention. And he's getting ready to be executed. So his friends, Simmias and Cebes, are distraught. Why are you so happy, Socrates? Aren't you worried you're going to die? He goes, no, I'm not going to die. I'm an eternal soul. I'll live on. Prove it to us. So they engage in conversation. So now he's just discussing what a soul is. And he's in this part, he's saying it's not a compound of parts. It's got to be a simple, unchanging thing. That's what David Hume is talking about. This perfect identity and simplicity doesn't exist because it's not empirically observable. So here's what Plato says in the Phaedo. He says, now the compound or composite may be supposed to be naturally capable of being dissolved just as it was compounded. But what is uncompounded, and that only, must be indissoluble, if anything is. Yes, that's what I'd imagine, said Cebes. And the uncompounded may be assumed to be the same and unchanging, where the compound is always changing and never the same. That I also think, he said. Then now let's return to the previous discussion in that idea or essence, which in the dialectical process we define as the essence of true existence, whether essence of equality, beauty, or anything else. Are these essences, I say, liable at times to some degree of change, or are they each of them always what they are, having the same simple, self-existent and unchanging forms, and not admitting of variation at all, or in any way, or at any time? They must be always the same, Socrates, replied Cebes. All right, so he's talking about the absolute ideas, the idea of beauty, the idea of justice. Anytime you see individual instances of beauty or justice in the material world, if somebody paying more money than they should, and then somebody else says, oh, you overpaid me, and giving it back. Why, that's just. It's just fair. Or a beautiful person, what is it that makes that person called beautiful and that person called beautiful? And this landscape beauty. What is the idea of beauty itself? What's that absolute standard of perfect beauty that you're referring to, or justice? Plato, famously a rationalist, who says knowledge comes from these absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, not from sense perceptions, which actually confuse you more than they help you. And that's absolutely the opposite of David Hume. He says these absolute ideas are imprinted on the soul. He also says in the Phaedrus, the other dialogue we read in this book, that those ideas are specifically located at the outermost sphere of the universe, which we'll come to. But the idea of a simple and unchanging self, that we see with Plato. As the absolute ideas are simple and unchanging, and the soul is invisible like them, then the soul is probably also unchanging and simple. That's his argument. It's called the argument by analogy. The soul's more like the ideas, the absolute forms of knowledge, than it is like material objects, so it's probably simple and unchanging, like those unchanging perfect ideas. It seems the soul is simply the collection of all of the absolute ideas, which are located in what Plato calls the idea of the good, and the soul is kind of like a spark from that supreme source of light. And therefore, each soul has all of these absolute ideas. All right, so that was part of the Phaedo that we can compare to David Hume. Another part, if you look back on page 252, here's where Plato is depicting Socrates attacking empiricism. So he says, well, but there's another thing, Simmias. Is there or is there not an absolute justice? Assuredly there is, and an absolute beauty and absolute good, of course. But did you ever behold any of them with your eyes? Certainly not. Or did you ever reach them with any other bodily sense? And I speak not of these alone, but of absolute greatness and health and strength, and of the essence or true nature of everything. Have you ever perceived the reality of them through your bodily organs? Or rather, isn't the nearest approach to the knowledge of their several natures made by one who so orders his intellectual vision as to have the most exact conception of the essence of that which he considers? Certainly, and he attains to the knowledge of them in their highest purity, who goes to each of them with the mind alone, meaning not the body. He does not allow, when in the act of thought, the intrusion or introduction of sight or any other sense in the company of reason, but with the very light of the mind in her clearness, he penetrates into the very light of truth. So he has got rid as far as he can of eyes and ears and of the whole body, which he conceives of only as a disturbing element, hindering the soul from the acquisition of knowledge when in company with her. Isn't this the sort of man who, if ever a man did, is likely to attain the knowledge of existence? That's the absolute opposite of David Hume. David Hume does not believe there is anything simple and continuous and unchanging. Yes, there are simple things, sense impressions, but they don't continue. They're in a constant flux. They're gone as soon as they start, and they're not connected in any other way than by imaginary ideas of relations such as cause and effect, which the Buddhists also point out, as I'll demonstrate. So back here on page 286 with David Hume, he says, in order to justify ourselves this absurdity of a continuing self, we often feign some new and unintelligible principle that connects the objects together and prevents their interruption or variation. So invent some unintelligible principle that connects them. Thus we feign the continued existence of the perceptions of our senses to remove the interruption and run into the notion of a soul and self and substance to disguise their variation. But we may further observe that where we do not give rise to such a fiction, our propension to confound identity with relation is so great that we are apt to imagine something unknown and mysterious connecting the parts besides their relation. A little lower on the left-hand column, he says that we have a propensity to such fictions. There's a common human instinct to create imaginary connecting principles in order to provide the ground of a self. Something must connect our unconnected memories to constitute a self, he says. You know, even if you can't prove it empirically, then you'll just make up something. Well, I'd imagine that is what David Hume would say about Plato's Phaedrus, where he talks about the outer sphere of the universe where all the absolute ideas exist. So before we turn to the Phaedrus, back in the Phaedo, after disrespecting sense perception on page 254 in the right-hand column, the next paragraph down, he says, but when returning into herself, he's talking about the soul, she reflects. Then she passes into the realm of purity and eternity and immortality and unchangeableness, which are her kindred, and with them she ever lives, when she is by herself unhindered. Then she ceases from her erring ways, and being in communion with the unchanging, is unchanging. And this state of the soul is called wisdom. Or he asks, and this state of the soul is called wisdom, so he's in communion with the unchanging absolute ideas when the soul comes into herself. Well, where is it where the soul comes into herself? If you look now in the Phaedrus, on page 257, the right-hand column, down at the very bottom, he says, but of the heaven which is above the heavens, so above the outermost sphere of fixed stars that revolve once a day, there's another heaven he's imagining. What earthly poet ever did or ever will sing worthily? I'll describe it, for I must dare to speak the truth, when truth is my theme. There abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned. The colorless, formless, intangible essence, visible only to the mind, the pilot of the soul. The divine intelligence being nurtured upon mind and pure knowledge, and the intelligence of every soul, capable of receiving the food proper to it, rejoices at beholding reality and once more grazing upon truth. She's replenished and made glad until the revolution of the world brings her round again to the same place. In the revolution she beholds justice and temperance and knowledge absolute, not in the form of generation or of relation, which men call existence, but knowledge absolute, in existence absolute, beholding the other true existences, and he goes on. So, that's exactly the opposite of David Hume. He would say, okay, that idea of this outermost cosmic horizon containing all of the absolute ideas and the soul merges with it and becomes simple and indivisible. Poppycock fiction, typical human fiction. All right, well, I would bring up to David Hume that according to holographic string theory, all of the information describing the past, the present, and the future of the whole universe is conserved at every point of the horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding at the speed of light away from Earth, from our perspective. And that same information radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation, on these fundamental elastic threads of energy to create the illusion of three-dimensional space with the objects enduring through time therein. Where is this one place where a sense perception is continued invariably the same? At the horizon of the cosmos. That's what people say they experience during near-death experiences. They say, like Carl Jung, for example, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his autobiography, in 1944, he had a heart attack. He felt his consciousness rise above his body, above the hospital, above the earth, and then eventually he said it seemed to him as if he was interwoven with the whole universe and with the past, the present, and the future blissfully at the horizon of the cosmos, and that what we endure here and the volume of the universe is as if we each live in a little cube of illusion tethered to the horizon by a thread. So that's very, very similar to Leonard Susskind, the atheist's holographic string theory, and it does provide exactly what David Hume is demanding, that he says, if any, on page 284, if any impression gives rise to the idea of the self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. When can we ever have the whole chain of our lives present before our eyes? John Locke asked the same question on page 277. He said, but that which seems to make the difficulty of believing in a soul is this, that this consciousness being interrupted always by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of all our past actions before our eyes in one view. So the fact that our memories are always interrupted implies we're not one unchanging, invariable soul. Well, people experience, during these near-death experiences, my whole life flashed before my eyes in an instant. That's exactly what John Locke says we don't experience. It never, the whole train of all our past actions before our eyes in one view. That's exactly what people say they experience. That's what Carl Jung said he experienced. That's what Eben Alexander, the Harvard neurosurgeon, said he experienced in his book, Life After Death, I believe it was. Let me see here. I have it open because I was looking at it in the previous video. Eben Alexander, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's near-death experience and journey into the afterlife. Plato wrote about the same thing, another near-death experience to the cosmic horizon in the Republic, where he even talks about the threads of destiny coming from the horizon inward. So is that just an imaginary principle that people come up with so they can believe in a self? Leonard Susskind's an atheist. He doesn't believe in a self, and yet the mathematics took him there. And the idea of mathematical truths brings up Plato's theory of absolute ideas. Hume says if it's not rooted in a sense impression, it's not real knowledge. Well, what about 2 + 2 = 4? Is that a human concoction? Did we create that? David Hume says yes. Plato would say no, that's an eternal absolute form of knowledge, the Pythagorean Theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared in a right angle triangle. A squared plus b squared, take this length and this length, square each, multiply this by that, multiply this by itself, add them up, it equals the length of the hypotenuse. That's an invariable and unchanging mathematical truth. Do humans invent it or do we discover it? Plato, via the literary character of Socrates, says we discover it. It's imprinted eternally on our souls. Hume says no, we invent it. So you get to decide which seems more reasonable to you, and of course you don't have to be aware of any of the physics that I talk about. It's just a helpful analogy, I hope. But going back here to our discussion questions. So exam 1, part B, questions 7, 8, and 9. According to Hume's empiricist philosophy, what conditions would be required for the existence of a self? All right. 1, continued, uninterrupted, simple, uncompounded memory of everything you've ever done. That's what you'd have to have. He doesn't believe in that. Plato does. So do the Buddhists. They talk about not the Buddhists, the Hindus. They talk about it in the Upanishads, pages 208 and 209. I just want to reiterate this because it's such an important part of philosophy, I think, that becomes more important in light of string theory. If you look on page 208 on the left-hand column, the Chandogya Upanishad, the intelligent whose body is spirit, whose form is light, whose thoughts are true, whose nature is like ether, omnipresent and invisible, is never surprised, he goes on to say, over on the Mundaka Upanishad, in him, he's talking about Brahman, the heaven, the earth, and the sky are woven, the mind also with all the senses. Know him alone as the self. Coming down a little bit, he says, he who understands all and who knows all, he to whom all this glory in the world belongs, the self, is placed in the ether, in the heavenly city of Brahman, where it's blissful. So the highest golden sheath there is Brahman, without passion and without parts. This cosmic horizon, the Akasha or ether, where all of the parts have all of the qualities of the whole. It seems to be a two-dimensional sphere, but the entire thing is located at each of its points. That's a new insight into cosmology with string theory that seems so similar to the Upanishads and Plato's cosmology. But how is, in what ways Hume's argument similar to Nagasena's Buddhist argument? Nagasena, like David Hume on page 289, he says, all of these nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided and are to be regarded rather as grammatical than as philosophical difficulties. Nagasena says the same thing on pages 224 and 225. King Malinda says to Nagasena, who are you? He goes, well, they call me Nagasena, but that's just a name. Really, there is no self. Just like there's no chariot. Chariot is just a word, a name, an appellation describing a bunch of parts, the wheels, the axle, the flagpole, that are temporarily combined in a loose way, but there's no enduring, unchanging chariot, and there's similarly no enduring, unchanging self. So that is how David Hume is very similar to Nagasena's argument. And then finally, in what ways are Hume's theory about the self different than Plato's? And we went over that extensively. So